Okay, so I'm going to start with something that was really hard for me because I'm doing my investigation in something that I love. Now, normally you'd think, wow, I love what I'm doing. This is so nice. Like, great, I get to spend all of this time investigating something that I like. Oh boy, you know so many things about what you like that you don't know what to pick and what not. And I've read so many books already. And how am I supposed to make one question? So I guess this is kind of for the people who are in IB1 still. And this is, how are you going to go from your starting point, I love literature, to how can I actually give this and get a good grade on it? So this is the first question I came up with. Yes, I had to come up with another question. I wrote my extended essay 2 full times, and it's still not perfect, but that's okay because every single time it got better. So my first question is, to what extent can the collection of poems, Birthday Letters, by Ted Hughes, be considered an exoneration or a vehicle of exoneration for some actions that he did? So let's touch on this first. So I think the first thing that you have to do to kind of pick, you see like this whole long thing like exoneration of this really fancy book and this person that I've never heard of, and what am I supposed to do? Oh no. Oh. Okay. See, what was I supposed to do? But it's okay because you got to kind of see what you have and see how you're going to take that and put it into something that you really care about, because that's going to be the best thing that you're going to be able to do. So for those of you who are still in IB1 and haven't done your extended essay yet, I know there's some people who are from college here, but you take something that you like. I've been reading my whole entire life in 2 languages, and I love reading. And it kind of allowed me to have like this own little world while there were other problems happening in my life. Like, oh, I'm in Spain and I don't speak Spanish. What am I going to do? Who am I going to talk to? So you always have that book with you and you're like, I love this story. So you kind of take that and you put something that you're interested in to something that's outside of your curriculum but related. Why? This is really important actually because you can't double dip. Now, the IB has a few books or a few guides or whatever, but we have this guide, and this is really thanks to like our extended essay coordinator who gave us so many facilities. And I know it's hard, but they're all on the internet if you just look them up. So we have this course companion, and inside of it, and your guide, which read it all the times that you can, read it 100 million times, highlight it, ask questions about it, because it's going to make you have that difference of what's going to make something, okay, yeah, I wrote something that I like, something academic, to something that the IB is looking for. So I really like this author named Sylvia Plath, who's Bostonian. My family's from Boston. She writes poetry. I've been reading poetry my whole life. And we're doing her in class. And it was like, that sucks because I love this. I love this poetry, but I don't want to risk putting my grades from my actual English class in harm's way because I'm double dipping, which is something you can't do. So I go, oh, well, she was married to an author too, and his name was Ted Hughes. And oh my God, they had like the biggest scandal ever. Sylvia Plath is such a talented author, and he is such a talented author too, but she killed herself and then left their kids to him. And then his next wife killed herself too. And he was blamed for so many years. And you see this and you're like, oh my God, like this is all in like 2 books. So you kind of take that and you pick something so that it's relevant. Okay, I'm doing poetry, there's stylistic features that's relevant to my class, but I'm not double dipping. So I'm going to be talking about Plath, referring to her, but my extended essay isn't going to be on one of the books that I'm doing in class. And then I have to go to the internet and I say, okay, are there enough, like places I can look up information? Because, okay, I might love zombie apocalypse movies, but how many academic articles are there on how do you make a very interesting zombie apocalypse movie? No, there's not. And that's okay, because you can always go back to the start and say, okay, I like this other thing just as much, but there's more resources for it. And that's how I got to Plath and Hughes were married, but there's a lot of controversy around what they're doing. So, you have to be concise with your question. Now, there's numerous different ways that you could start it. Everyone here is kind of starting with to what extent in Spanish, but there's pros and cons to everything that you do. So you're going to use some in different situations. And this isn't to judge and say, well, I used how can, so my study is going to be better. Oh, I used to what extent, and that means that I have more breadth of vision. No, everything's okay, but you have to take into account what that question means. So to what extent? So this is very flexible. You can look at a lot of different areas. But how are you going to prove that in something like literature? Both of the authors that I'm looking at are dead. They're dead, you know what I mean? Like, who am I going to ask? Her book was published after her death, so there's no questions about, what were you thinking about when you wrote this? No. And then he published his, which is a response to her initial book, like a couple months before he died of cancer, on purpose so no one could ask him questions. And now I'm like, okay, so like how am I supposed to prove to what extent if I didn't say anything about it? Then you can have how can. So you need a lot of resources to back this up, which is going to be something really good because here you can prove you read. Like how can someone do something? Well, they can do it this way, and then there's going to be a lot of theory behind that. And that's great for you because the IB is going to be like, this person read books. Like, they didn't just read a Wikipedia article. They didn't just ask their teacher once or twice. No, they read a lot. But then, like, how many sources can you actually have when something is so specific? Like, I'm doing something that people do in college sometimes. There's, like, whole masters on Hughes and Plath and, like, how their relationship intermingled with their literature. So that can also be really hard, too. And then you have another type of question, which is a little bit less frequently used, let's say. And that's in what ways does? Well, that's pretty easy, right? You don't have the obligation to fulfill any specific blocks. You don't have to say everything because you're showing one way. In what way does this person express this one thing? See, that might sound a little bit easier, but what if you're vague and then you don't actually get your criteria? So you have to take all of these things into consideration before elaborating that question because that question has to be answered 1,000,000 times in your extended essay, or if not, you didn't research anything really. Because if the examiner reads it and it's like, oh, this is so interesting, but did they answer the question? What were you writing your extended essay for in the first place? So, you need to prove that you researched. I read it, and I read a poem, and I say, well, obviously he's angry here. Can't you hear, like, the tone? Or, oh, he doesn't want forgiveness. He doesn't feel like he has to be forgiven. Well, okay, I promise, I believe you. That's probably very valid, especially in literature that's really well known. Like, everyone knows that this happened then. Let's give an example. I don't know how many of you have read To Kill a Mockingbird, but that was something we had to read in the States. Everyone read it all the time. And you know that talks about racism. But how can you prove that? Just because you've heard that it's talking about racism? You have to take exact quotes from the text and then say, oh, but it's not only me who's saying this. It's a lot of other critics too. So, I believe you, but where did you get that from? So you have to show different sources, and sources are very important too. You can't just read 1 or 2 books and be like, oh, I'm the queen of the world, I'm using all of these resources from one book. It's really important, especially in literature, to look at academic journals and reviews. And there are so many of these from college students who have already done work like this. There's so many of these from professors that are given to college students. So as long as you know how to concisely look at what your rigorous sources are going to be, you'll be fine. Okay, one of the hardest criterions to fill in your extended essay is criterion C. It's 12 points. 12 points. And you look at that and you're like, I'm not going to get those 12 points. You know what I mean? 12 points. How am I going to get all 12 of them? this is how. Okay, so critical thinking is all about you understanding something that you read, something that you know, and being able to apply it in a way so that other people can understand it in the same light that you have. So, instead of taking this quote, this is a quote that I used in my extended essay, but I paraphrased it. And it's a quote that this lady named Wagner recounts that Ted Hughes, the author that I'm studying, says. And it's, I know too that the alternative, remaining silent, referring to his wife's suicide, makes me a projection post for every worst suspicion, that my silence seems to confirm every accusation and fantasy. Now that's a great quote. Something that the author said, someone who was extremely silent on the matter at hand, said directly about this? Okay, but is this a primary source? This is something really important, especially in literature. Your primary sources are going to be, for example, from the book that you're analyzing, something from that text. Okay, you can't paraphrase that because who's going to say something better about the book that you wrote than the book itself? But this, which would be a supporting document, which is a secondary source, needs to be paraphrased so that I can show the IB that I understood what I read, and not only did I understand it, I know how to apply it and reapply it to the situation I'm going to be studying.
Eva.
¿Sí? Vale, perfecto. So, Wagner recounts one of Hughes's only statements regarding his silence in her book, Ariel's Gift. I tell you where I'm getting it from, I'm telling you who the author is without directly having to just state their name and when that was. I say, in which he claimed that the public perceived his every action, even silence, as a confirmation of guilt. Now, I'm saying what he said, but I'm saying it in my own words, applied to the question at hand. And that way I can kind of prove that I know what he said, and I'm going to show you that I know what he said in reference to my question. Exoneration of guilt, confirmation of guilt. And most importantly, and this is like my final note after like the paraphrasing, is if you are having like such a hard time on your extended essay and it's confusing even to you, don't do it on that. And if you're really, really having a hard time and you feel bad about what you're doing and you don't like it, don't do it. If it's even boring for you to read, don't do it. Because this has to be something that you're going to be passionate about and that you like in the end. So my problem was, this was so hard to do. How was I supposed to prove how guilty or not guilty someone was in literature that's reevaluated every decade or so? How am I going to prove, when no one else has really, this whole concept in just 2 years while I'm doing my IAs and all of my other exams? So you change it into something easier because you don't need to prove something necessarily in literature. You just need to show that you understand it. So if it's boring for you, change it and do something that you love, because this is a projection to the IB and saying, I picked this study for me. It's not something that you have to do in your course book, like you have to learn how to derivar in math. No, this is something that you get to choose, so make it worth it. And that's all. Thank you.